Good morning, everybody. It's going to be a good class this morning. I'm excited to continue on in our study in the book of Nehemiah. You can be opening up to Nehemiah chapter 6. That's where we're going to be spending most of our time, with a little bit of time in chapter 7 as well. And once you're open there, let's go ahead and start with a word of prayer before we begin our study. Our dear God in heaven, we are blessed to be here this morning, and we ask that you would focus our hearts and our minds on you, on your goodness and your glory, on your power and your ability. We come here not because we are anything good of our own accord, but because you have loved us with a faithful, consistent love, just like you loved the people in this day and age for Nehemiah and his group of people, and you showed your faithfulness as you continue to for us today. Help us to have a good study and to draw nearer to you because of it. In your Son's name, amen. Okay, so we are in the end of chapter 6, and I was thinking about this from a plot standpoint. You know, I didn't prepare the slide for this one, but if you can picture the basic plot chart that you would have seen in high school English class, you have your opening, and you have kind of your setting the stage, and then you have what they call the rising action and a conflict, and then you have the pinnacle or the climax of the story, and then you start to have your falling action and your resolution. And so we have made it right here to the pinnacle. This is the big moment where we've set the stage, we've had the conflict, we've had all of the opposition, and we're getting to the moment where we get the payoff and the wall is completed. And so we're going to be mostly focused on just a few verses at the end of chapter 6. And if you compare it to kind of our other classes, we're doing a lot of text relatively quickly at the beginning of the class. After this class, we're going to go back to a little bit quicker pace, and we're going to be knocking through the second half of the book. But here we're going a little bit slower by design, because this is the payoff. This is what everything up to this point has led to. And so I want us to really slow down and think about what it means that the wall got completed and what are the lessons that we can draw from it. In our last class, you may remember we did chapter 6, verses 1 through 14, and we had 3 last attempts to derail Nehemiah. So the wall is getting close to done. He says, I've done everything except hang the gates, and so that just makes the opposition get all the more bold. And I've got them labeled up here: the pleasant invitation, the rumors and lies, the false religion. They're throwing anything that they can at Nehemiah to try to get the work slowed. And along the way, we talked about what we could learn from that and lessons on how to stay focused. And I've got a few of those things listed there, things like relying on the Lord and staying focused on Him, learning how to discern, and staying prayerful to make sure that we don't fall into those pitfalls. Where we're going to pick up today, well, and as a reminder, we said the city and its people were without walls, and we're going to be kind of closing, maybe not closing, but really like putting a big emphasis on that theme, because we've gone from defenseless to now defended and being God's people again. And that's what we're going to talk about today, is the completion of the wall and what it meant originally, and then what it means for us, because we're not just talking about an ancient wall and an ancient people, we're talking about the principles for our lives. We're also going to go a little bit out of my comfort zone into archaeological and historical evidence to back up Nehemiah's wall. So just a few things that I found in researching the topic to just kind of emphasize that these were real events, this was a real place, these were real people, and there's some really cool stuff that backs that up and bears that out. And then we're going to spend just a few minutes in chapter 7, which is mostly a list of people who returned to the land, but there's a few key things that I think we'll get out of that text as well. So let's read just a couple verses to begin with. Ryan, would you mind to read for us just chapter 6, verses 15 and 16?
So the wall was finished on the 25th day of the month, Elul, in 52 days. And when all our enemies heard of it, all the nations around us were afraid and fell greatly in their own esteem, for they perceived that this work had been accomplished with the help of our God.
Okay, so I'll open it up for you all first. What do you notice in that section? What stands out to you? Yeah, very good. So the nations look, and they've been watching how this is going to go, and they see the completion, and it has an effect on them. Good. Yeah, we'll talk more about that. What else? Sure, Ryan?
Kind of a statement of national identity as well.
Mm-hmm.
They're all surrounded and they're all called out by their God.
Mm-hmm.
Communal.
Yeah. Yeah, good. And that's part of what we'll see here and in chapter 7 with this long list of returnees, is that there's a sense of community and a sense of it took a lot of people to bring this effort about, even though sort of our focus is on Nehemiah. Good. What else? How long did it take for the wall to be finished? 52 days. Yeah. So we're gonna talk about that a pretty good bit. So how long is 52 days? If you've ever tried to do a complicated project at work where you're pulling together a lot of different teams and you're doing a lot of coordinating, how much do you think you're able to get done in 7 weeks on a project like that? You know, you might be more advanced in your career than I am, but my answer is often very little. Like 7 weeks is just enough time to herd people, to wrangle them, to define objectives, to figure out what you're doing, and maybe to get started on a project. And you look at this huge endeavor, 7 weeks, and they're done, 52 days. I was curious for another way to frame up 52 days, and I didn't plan this, but it worked out really, really well. So does anybody know how long we've been studying the book of Nehemiah? 52 days, right? July 1st to August 22nd, 52 days. I mapped it out meticulously. You know, we went through the syllabus so that today on day 52 we hit it. But you think about that, I mean, that's just a few weeks. You know that from July 1st to now, like, what have we accomplished in our lives? Not to get depressing, but you're just kind of like, I don't know, I did some dishes, like I went to work. It's just kind of, that's not a long period of time, but 52 days from July 1st to now is how long it took them to build the wall. And so one of the things you might be asking is just sort of the practical, well, how was the wall finished in 52 days? And this is coming from the NIV commentary on Nehemiah. There's a few things that they threw out. The first one is that a lot of the wall was being built on top of ruins, not just from scratch. So it wasn't a matter of just laying every single stone in a place that it had never been laid before. But if you remember at the beginning of the book, I'll see if I can get the wording from chapter 1. But they say that the wall of Jerusalem in chapter 1 and verse 3, the wall of Jerusalem is broken down and the gates are destroyed by fire. So it's ruin and rubble, but it's still maybe a foundation that can be built off of. We also have, of course, the sense of urgency from the danger. So this was not a project where the people could just take as long as they wanted and bring in some architects and lay out the plans and do a lot of that kind of work. This was, there are enemies right outside. Sometimes there are enemies within the city themselves, plotting, scheming, and so we need to get this wall done as quickly as we can, right? Even when there was a threat, they put the sword in one hand and the building tool in another and kept going because time was of the essence. One of the things that was brought out in the commentary I was looking at was a similar account in Athens where a wall was built in about a month when they were threatened by enemies. This was 400 AD versus 400 BC, but the principle is still kind of there, that there's other somewhat similar events of, hey, we need to get this constructed right now, and the whole nation is kind of working as one people to get that done. And then one more thing to just sort of know and maybe tuck away is that this is a smaller Jerusalem than David's Jerusalem or Jesus's Jerusalem. Because you think about the fact that the city was mostly uninhabited at this point. They're starting to come back. Most of the people are living in outlying towns. And so the wall was built around a relatively small portion of the city. The references that I had said somewhere between 1.5 miles and 2.5 miles around that we're building a wall. So still a serious project and a good undertaking, but maybe on a slightly different scale than what we might be expecting. Okay, Luke, did you have a comment earlier? I think I might have skipped over you.
It was 52 days, you said?
Mm-hmm.
That includes Sabbaths.
I was wondering that, and I don't know if we know definitively. My best guess, if you'll allow me to guess, is that they probably were pausing on the Sabbath because Nehemiah really emphasizes the Sabbath and he stops trade on the Sabbath later. but I'm not totally sure on that. So this stuff is interesting, I think, of how it got done and thinking about the project and the way that it was brought to completion. But a lot more interesting and more relevant is the why and the takeaways and the lessons learned. And so I've been teeing this up for a while. We talked about it some last week. And so I'll open it up to you first. What do you think are the lessons that we can take from the wall being completed and being completed in just a few weeks? Jay?
Leadership. I mean, if you think of the times during the kings, an entire nation could be made or broken based on who the king was.
Mm-hmm.
So if you think of, I'm not saying Nehemiah was the king, but if you think of him as the leader of Jerusalem of the day, he led it in such a way that they were able to do it.
Yeah, absolutely. And he gets the role of governor, so he's, as best they have, he's their central figure. And someone brought this out to me recently. They said, if you look at the Old Testament, the people never surpass the character of their leader. Like, you have a good leader, you might have a good group of people, you might not, but you never have a bad leader and a good group of people consistently across the nation who just overcome that. The leader is setting the tone in a lot of ways and driving things forward. So good thought. What else? Yeah, Ryan?
I think chapter 4 and verse 6 describes a lot of it, that people had a mind to work.
Mm-hmm.
And, if they're ready to go and they have good leadership to lead them, then that's a huge part of it.
Yeah, very good. So it was almost 100 years that the project went undone, and certainly the people would have seen the wall, they would have known about the wall, they would have maybe walked past the wall, and it just took some kind of a catalyst. And in that case, it is Nehemiah, but it's also the people having the mind to say, yeah, let's pick this up and let's do it, and let's really be focused on the task. Good. Other thoughts? Becky?
I think that the result, Jessica kind of already talked about how the people realized this was from God, but I think it's also interesting that they're disheartened about it. And then it just makes me think, like, if I'm doing what I'm supposed to do and working for the Lord, then I'm going to frustrate the people that are trying to stop that work.
Mm-hmm.
That's a good thing.
Yeah.
Maybe they'll be so frustrated they'll leave me alone.
Yeah, good. So let me build off a few of those. And there's one, to me, there was one big one that was kind of jumping out. And we were talking about 100 years of a project being undone, and then it gets done in 52 days. And what can we learn from that, and what's the thought? And to me, the thing that was standing out was the idea that I think one of the great tricks that the enemy plays on us is to just make those things that we want to do for God look impossibly huge. Just 100 years of people, generations came and they looked at the wall, and we don't know much about it, but I think it's fair to conclude that they either didn't start at all or started rebuilding a little bit and quickly got discouraged, and nothing really happened. And it just seemed like such a big undertaking, and how would we do this? And we've established that the people they're poor, they were discouraged, they were beaten down, they don't have their own identity. And so they just look at this time after time and just kind of throw up their hands and say, what can we do? And then finally, they have the mind to work, they have the faith in God, they start working with God, and it's done in less than 2 months. Can't you just imagine them saying, like, that was it? That was it? Like, we waited 100 years and we did it in less than 2 months? And I think that there are some parallels, at least to my own life, where I have sometimes built up something that I want to do and just said, well, I just wouldn't know where to begin. It's so big. I don't know the right plan, the right approach. And then if you finally kind of step out and try it, maybe it's not quite as scary and as big and as huge as we thought when we were on the sidelines. I'll share an example to maybe bring this to life a little bit. But for me, one of these wall-type projects that you're always thinking about and never quite know where to start was like to start some kind of a little Bible study that you could invite kind of people from the community, that it'd be geared towards people who don't really know the Bible, and we could have a discussion. And I'd kicked that idea around, and I was trying to maybe plan it out and spending too long on the planning stage and the ideation stage and the someday stage. And I'll brag on Morgan and try not to embarrass her too much, but she came up to me at services one time and she said, I invited somebody to a Bible study, but I don't really think we have a Bible study going right now that would be good for them. So, maybe we could start one. And I said, sure, yeah. When did you tell your friend we were going to do it? And she's like, day after tomorrow. Okay, let's mobilize. And so we got a couple people together and we said, hey, we're going to do this Bible study. And eventually we started trying to post about it online and getting a few people to come, and had some good conversations that stemmed from that, and we're able to do that study for a while. And that to me was this wall seems so big, I don't know where to start, I don't know how to do it, and I'm intimidated by it. And if we'll just get started with faith, with trusting in God, with tapping into one another's strengths, a lot of times that wall is not as big and as menacing as we think, and it's incumbent on us to simply start and have faith that God can help us through. I was calling this principle, God accomplishes the impossible. And I almost put the impossible in quotes because a lot of times it's what seems to us as impossible, but it's not impossible. But I didn't want to limit it because it really can be impossible by our standards, but possible with God. Things that we can't even fathom are routine for God. And I was reminded of the prayer in Ephesians chapter 3, verses 20 and 21. I can just read that for us. But Paul addresses this prayer to God and says, "Now to him who is able to do far more abundantly than all we ask or think, according to the power at work within us, to him be the glory in the church and in Christ Jesus throughout all generations, forever and ever. Amen." To him who can do far more abundantly than we can ask or think. The biggest undertakings, the greatest spiritual projects or work or building that we can imagine, God is able to do it, and it's not a strain for him, even though it's going to push us to get started on it. So in just a second, I want to ask you, get your wheels turning about what are Bible examples of this principle. And I think you'd find all throughout the pages of Scripture, there's things that people seem intimidated to do and don't know how to start, but with God's help, they're able to accomplish. So I want to ask for some examples here in a second. But before we do that, I just want to sort of give that word of encouragement and that I need to hear myself, that just to get us off the sidelines and to say whatever that project is, whatever thing we've been building up, if it's inviting someone to read the Bible with us, if it's getting more engaged and finding ways to encourage our brethren, if it's opening up our home, if it's doing something for people who are less fortunate and don't have much, whatever that project is, I think if we'll turn to God, if we have faith just to get started, Jesus will famously say, if you have faith like a mustard seed, you can tell this mountain to go move into the sea and it'll be done. It's really not about us. It's just about having that beginning spark of faith to get something started and then watch what God can do with it. So what do you think? Let me open it up to you guys. Just comments, and also I'm looking for examples of this principle of things that seem insurmountable but that get accomplished throughout the Scripture. Ryan?
Just one quick comment. I know that we've been talking a lot about unity of the people. And in chapter 3, we have this long list of the builders of the wall, and we can get bogged down reading all the names. One of the really neat things is that oftentimes it'll list the occupation of that person. And you have everyone from, in verse 15, officials of the district, so governors. In 26, the temple servants, and even in 28, the priests themselves are out working. So there's this idea that everyone from the soldier to the craftsman is out doing a task, and I think it's even beautiful. They list family members, father and son, going out and working on one specific tower. So I know that you mentioned you and Morgan doing your study, and this because you two came together and you both worked on it. You were both able to bring whatever talents was required. But then that story of unity comes out again.
Yeah, perfect. And that also gets to the kind of the stretch aspect of it. That these people weren't professionals and they didn't have all the tools necessary, but they were under good guidance and they went out and they were able to do it as a unit more than they could have done on their own. Yeah, Jay?
I was thinking, kind of going back to from the very beginning when Nehemiah was figuring out what to do, praying to God, and then he got the king, the mighty king on board. If you think of, if you want to say, well, the most powerful nation in the world, so the president's the most powerful man in the world, you've got the most powerful man in the world helping you.
Right.
So he's gotten all the resources, much to what Brian's saying. Not only have you got all the workers, you've got your financial backing, you've got your investor.
Yeah.
I mean, you've got the involvement that you needed to get. That's what you did.
That's perfect. Because the more that I've seen the book, the more that's almost the miracle that sparks everything else. That it's great that the people can come together to work, but if they didn't have the authorization to do it, and the funds, and the safety, and the security, and the leadership sent from Persia, and all of that was needed to.
Yeah, I was thinking about that too. The letters, he went and made sure he had everything he needed to even get there.
Yeah, and that to me is such a good picture of God's abundance and God's supplying. And Nehemiah didn't know exactly how things were going to play out, but he had everything he needed. Good. So what about some Bible examples of God working a task that people may have thought was improbable or impossible? Luke and Jessica? Mm-hmm.
It's like, it's kind of one individual. We see God working through one individual, but just how he didn't stop when he knew it was right.
Yeah.
Even when he was sold into slavery and then put in prison, he kept on doing what he could do.
Good. Thank you. Yeah. Jessica?
I have two. The Israelites leaving Egypt,
Mm-hmm.
they overthrew a nation basically without ever picking up a weapon, and then Gideon. And
Good.
his knights.
Very good. Yeah, I think both of those are spot on. They're both on my list, so bonus points there. But yeah, the Exodus, Gideon's army. Any others that were coming to mind before I rattle off some? Mark?
Steve Shitlaw says, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, Peter walking on the water, and water changed to wine.
Perfect, yeah. And I really do think if you start to just think through this lens of it seemed like men couldn't do it, but God was able to deliver it. I mean, what Bible story, what great miracle or act of faith doesn't fit into that, you know? So I was thinking about the Exodus. I love the ones that Steve mentioned. You think about Elijah at Mount Carmel and the great display of God that comes and overwhelms the hundreds of prophets of Baal. Or even if you just kind of think about this era of captivity and then return from captivity, and it's a time of difficulty for the people, but God is still showing that he's in charge, and that's where you get Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. That's where you get Daniel in the lion's den. That's where you get Esther delivering the people from a near slaughter. Prophetically, in the book of Ezekiel, you get the dry bones resurrected. There are all these things that just seem like a hopeless situation and something that can't be done, but through God, great things are possible. And this is my plug that I have to force into every lesson, that God is the hero. You know, it's not, I don't want us to come away, this is such an action-packed book. I don't want us to come away and say, well, I just need to do more, and I just have to charge out there, and I just have to make it all happen. I do think some of that activity and a little of that spurring is useful, but it is about us partnering with God, us asking God for guidance and leaning on him and starting something, but knowing that he'll be the one to provide the increase. Sandy?
I think of the Apostle Paul, the enormous responsibility that he had to preach the world, about Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
And, by the end of his life, the world knew about Jesus.
Yep.
And he was just one man, that started that work and how God made it happen.
Yeah, very good. Very good. So yeah, from Paul and a handful of apostles out to the whole world is how the gospel was spread. And I just wanted to sort of let us marinate and spend a little bit of time here, because I think it's really easy for us to be interested in the conflict and the struggle and everything that happens, and then, oh, great, God delivers, and then now let's get on to the next thing. And sometimes even in my life, I follow that pattern of you're really invested before the payoff, but then God delivers and think, okay, great, and now I can sort of put that behind us. And it's worth us slowing down and reflecting on the way that he leads through to really build our faith and to build our confidence and build our trust for the next time that something happens. Let's go over a couple more lessons that I think stood out, and then if you have others, I'd love to hear them. So we were already touching on this, but we've talked a lot about how the era of Nehemiah can be thought of as a second Exodus. And in our text in chapter 6 and verse 16, it tells us when all the enemies heard of it, the nations around us were afraid and fell greatly in their own esteem, for they perceived that this work had been accomplished with the help of our God. So there's another Exodus tie-in, is the surrounding nations hear of a great deliverance and a great victory from God, and they realize this is not like anything else. They fall in their own esteem. Early in the book of Joshua, Rahab is still talking about the victories that the Israelites got right when they were leaving and conquering the first couple of kings. And this is a couple of generations later. Rahab is still saying, I know about your God. And that was the kind of ripple effect that those events had. And similarly here, the people surrounding that try to stop the work, they hear of it and they think this could only have been accomplished with the help of God. We've talked earlier throughout the class, but we'll just kind of follow the thread of the value of prayer and preparation, because we get to this 52 days, and it's a good chance to remember that Nehemiah prayed and prepared for 4 months before embarking on it. And so one of the commentaries that I was looking at said, this shows us sometimes the spiritual work and the spiritual side of things is more important than the physical side of things. He spent twice as much time praying and asking God for guidance as it actually took to follow through on the work itself. And then we've talked a ton about resistance, and so I think it's good to remember that resistance can be overcome with a focus on God. It's discouraging, it can slow us, it can get in our path, but it doesn't have to be the end just because there's pushback on our work. If we stay focused on God, if we let Him lead, then whatever obstacles are in the path can be overcome. So any other thoughts that you want to talk about as we think about the wall being completed? Okay. Why do you think there was so much resistance? Why were the nations so upset? What was it about the wall?
I think it could be jealousy in a part. I know that Moses talks in the beginning of Deuteronomy before he gives the second law about how the other nations will look at you and they're going to call you just, but they're going to be jealous that your orphans and your widows eat, which is just a peculiar thing to say, but you see a people who are clearly being blessed by God and being made successful through the hand of God, and that's odd if you're a nation that doesn't have that, that doesn't have that relationship to gain that sort of mutual success.
Yeah, good. I do think there's a sense of jealousy, and there's also a sense of sort of complacency that had happened where the Jews were comfortable with the people of the land, and the people of the land enjoyed sort of the status and rule that they had over the Jews. You think about sort of the named enemies that we had of Sanballat and Tobiah and Geshem, and they're kind of local rulers or governors or people who have some power. And so for the wall to be built, it's to sort of put an end to that and say, inside here is God's people. And it's a line in the sand that says, these belong to God and everyone else doesn't. And what we're going to see, even in the rest of chapter 6 here, is that there were some people who didn't want that and who were happy, even among the Jews I'm talking about, who were happy to sort of have one foot in God's city and one foot outside, that could sort of go in and out whenever they want. Why do we need a wall? Why do we need a gate? When we can just sort of try to have the best of both worlds. So let's go on to chapter 6, verses 17 through 19. Let me get a reader. Brennan, would you read for us 6, 17 through 19?
Yep. Moreover, in those days the nobles of Judah sent many letters to Tobiah, and Tobiah's letters came to them. For many in Judah were bound by oath to him, because he was the son-in-law of Shechaniah, the son of Arah, and his son Jehoiakim had taken the daughter of Meshulam, the son of Berechiah, as his wife. Also, they spoke of his good deeds in my presence and reported my words to him. And Tobiah sent letters to make me afraid.
Awesome. Sorry, tough reading, but thanks for soldiering through here. Okay. What do you see about Tobiah's relationship with the Jews? What stands out?
In my opinion, because we expect we expect Tobiah and Sanballat and Geshem to be enemies and to do enemy things. They're supposed to. Like, that's their function in the world, is to be enemies.
Mm-hmm.
And so if they're not being enemies, then they're not doing it right. But the fact that there are people inside the wall working with the enemies outside, that to me is the biggest problem in this whole book.
Yeah, I think that's really well said. So it's not just that there is opposition, but the friendliness between the opposition and the people on the inside. I mean, did you notice in verse 18, many in Judah were bound by oath to him. So they're, in a way, they've tied their hands and they've said, we're going to go with Tobiah. And in verse 19, they spoke of his good deeds in my presence. You know, think about people ostensibly who are on the Jewish side and who are there at the building of the wall, and they say, Nehemiah, Tobiah's not so bad. You know, he did this, this, and this, and really he's a good guy. And in verse 19, they reported my words, Nehemiah's words, back to him. So presumably people who Nehemiah feels like are friends and are on the inside, and then they kind of run back out and say, here's what's happening, here's what they're feeling, here's where they're progressing, maybe even here's a weak spot in the wall. And you see that, and it's pretty staggering, and I think it puts into context what we've been talking about, the need for a wall, the need for separation, because the friendliness and the coziness with people who didn't belong on the inside is just jarring. Ezra, when he came through 13 years earlier and in the same time as Nehemiah, he's bringing about a religious reform. He's the priest, and kind of the big thing that he's harping on is don't get involved in marriage alliances with the people of the land. And you see why he would have cared so much about that in a text like this. You've got him, Tobiah is tied together through marriage relationships, and he's tied together through these oaths, and it's just sticky. And it's a web of entanglement that it's really hard to untangle from. And in fact, some of the people don't seem that interested in getting out from it because they're sort of happy with the way things are and with a great friendliness with people who are opposed to God. And I think there's probably a lot that we could learn from it, but sort of for the sake of time, I think we'll just boil it down to beware of outside influences and be careful what we let in. You know, it's great if we can build a wall and build distinctiveness and holiness, but we have to be really careful of the types of bonds that we have, especially with people who are antagonistic. I always get a little bit wary saying that because we're supposed to be the lights of the world and we're supposed to be a good influence, and I don't want to diminish that at all, but just at the same time, we have to be careful of what we let in and of how close we get attached to people who are pulling in the opposite direction as us. All right, so we've got a little bit of time left, and so I want to kind of shift a little bit because we've been talking about the wall, and I was able to do a little bit of research on kind of some of the historical facts, the archaeological facts, just to back up and validate the idea that these are real people, real places, and real events. I will give the disclaimer, I'm not an archaeologist, I'm not a historian, I'm not, anything other than a man armed with a laptop, and I tried to be scrupulous in terms of sourcing and finding really airtight and even secular things that would back up the Bible record, but I think that this is worth considering and sort of seeing what you think of the evidence that's been found in the Bible land from this era, just to drive home again that these were real things that have happened. So for a long time, there wasn't very much found from the Persian era in Jerusalem. There's all kinds of digs happening in the Holy Lands, as they call it, and the Persian era was not something that had come back with a lot of artifacts yet. And I think if you think about that, that kind of makes sense. There's a lot of layers to the Jewish history, and this was not a particularly long one. And we've talked about the fact that not that many people came back to the land during the Persian era. So they're looking and looking, and there's only kind of been scraps of things that have come back from the Persian era until 2007. And I've shown this image a few times, but this is a portion of the wall that I think the best way to say it is it's believed to be Nehemiah's wall. It seems like in my research, you can always find some skeptic who will say, well, no, it could have been later, but there's a lot of evidence backing this up. So what was going on here is they were doing some excavation around Jerusalem, and they were digging out a tower that they thought was from about 150 BC. So about 300 years after the time of Nehemiah, what they call the Hasmonean era, and when the Maccabees were around. So kind of in that intertestamental period. That's what they thought they were looking for. And they get to this tower, and they start finding something that looks different. They find all these shards of Persian pottery that are tucked into the wall. Clearly, this is Persian pottery from around like 450 BC, like right in the era of Nehemiah. And they think, well, that's interesting. You know, like here's a wall, and there's some Persian artifacts. And then, this is really interesting, I think. So they're digging around and trying to sort of piece together, what is this wall and when is it from? And they find 2 buried dogs. I'm sorry if well, maybe it's good if you're a dog lover, because apparently the Persians treated dogs really, really nice. This is like unique to the Persians. It says, dog burials of this kind are characteristic of a specific historic setting, the Persian period. It appears that the Persian faith held dogs to have a holy status and linked them to health and medicine. So, okay, we got Persian pottery, we've got some dogs who are treated really nice. Like, that's kind of a unique and funky thing that we're going to attribute to the Persian time period. And then they look at this wall as well and kind of say, well, I'll read it directly from the article here. The tower and the wall were not masterpieces of engineering. Their construction quality showed that they had been built hastily. What does that point you towards? And then as they're digging in more, okay, we've got it pinned down to the Persian era. Well, later in the Persian era, when Jerusalem was sort of back on its feet, it was a small little government outpost. And so they'd see government documents and particularly seals that would say, this is from the region of Yehud. That's what they called Judah. And so later in the Persian period, they found all these seals that say Yehud, Yehud, Yehud. And they don't find any of those here, which is pointing them towards an early Persian period with early Persian pottery and a hastily built wall. I just think that's so cool. So again, there is some skeptic at the end of every article. It's the same guy. His name's Israel Finkelstein. And he says, like, well, we don't know for sure. This could have been from a later time. So I feel compelled to throw that out there, that maybe there's a different wall that has Persian pottery that's from 450 BC that's hastily constructed. But I think it's pretty amazing when you start to look into this stuff to really bear this out. What about Nehemiah himself? I was doing some research there. This is from the Encyclopedia Britannica, which I know it's small font. I can read it for us, but kind of known as one of the most trusted sources in the world. And here's their write-up on Nehemiah. Nehemiah, also spelled Nehemias, a Jewish leader who supervised the rebuilding of Jerusalem in the mid-5th century BC after his release from captivity by the Persian king Artaxerxes I. He instituted extensive moral and liturgical reform in rededicating the Jews to Yahweh. He was cupbearer to the king, and it goes on. Does that sound familiar? I mean, it sounds like the Encyclopedia Britannica cut and pasted from the book of Nehemiah because it's viewed as an accurate historical record of the time, and there are things that are corroborating it. And then one more thing that I wanted to show you, this old piece of papyrus called the Elephantine papyrus number 30 from 407 BC. So archaeologists have uncovered some letters from an era and from a small group of Jewish people who are actually outside the Holy Land down close to Egypt. They're sending letters back and forth, and so they use these letters to kind of understand what's going on in this era. And in 407 BC, 30 years after Nehemiah, they write in the papyrus, and it says, we're sending this letter in our name to Delaiah and Shelmiah, the sons of Sanballat, the governor of Samaria. So right contemporarily to Nehemiah, this letter is addressed to the sons of Sanballat, the governor of Samaria, just validating one of the major figures in the book and his title and the fact that he would have been someone who was prominent and who would have made sense to oppose the rebuilding of the wall. And it also mentions Jehohanan, who is the son of the high priest at this time. So I just wanted to take that little brief detour to kind of show you a few of the things between the wall, the seals, the Persian pottery, the mention of Sanballat, to drive home the fact that when we read this story, it's something that the more things start to come up for history, the more that we can see consistency and accuracy in the account here. Anything that you want to say to that? No, it doesn't maybe lend itself to comments quite as well, but hopefully you thought it was cool. Let's read chapter 7, verses 1 through 10, and we're going to close out class that way. Jake, could you read chapter 7, verses 1 through 10?
Yep.
Thank you.
Now when the wall had been built, and I had set the doors and the gatekeepers, the singers, and the Levites had been appointed, I gave my brother Hananiah, the governor of the castle, charge over Jerusalem, for he was more faithful in God-fearing man than many. And I said to them, let not the gates of Jerusalem be opened until the sun is hot, and while they are still standing guard, let them shut and bar the doors. Appoint guards from among the inhabitants of Jerusalem, some at their guard posts and some in front of their homes. The city was wide and large, but the people within it were few, and no houses had been rebuilt. Then my God put into my heart to assemble the nobles and officials and the people to be enrolled by genealogy. And I found the book of the genealogy of those who came up at the first, and I found written in it. These were the people of the province who came up out of the captivity of the exiles whom Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, had carried into exile. They returned to Jerusalem and Judah, each to his town. They came from Zerubbabel, Jeshua, Nehemiah, Azariah, Ramiah, Nahum, Mordecai, Bilshan, Mispereth, Bigvai, Nahum, and Bana.
Perfect. That's a good. I told you through verse 10, but you've suffered through enough names there. But I just wanted to sort of let you see what was in chapter 7. We're not going to really get to dive into it, but first of all, Nehemiah says, I put a couple of other people in charge. I put Hananiah, my brother, who's mentioned in chapter 1, and another person also named Hananiah. These guys are going to be in charge because they're faithful, God-fearing men. And so I think it's good to see Nehemiah is not someone who cares about power. He's not interested in holding on to it. As soon as the wall's done, he is going to take more and more of a backseat throughout the rest of this book. Let me appoint some other faithful, God-fearing men. Next time we're going to see in chapter 8, Ezra comes to read the law. Like, he's going to make sure that the priests and the Levites are able to do their job of teaching, and he's not inserting himself there. His goal is just to get the people back to the Lord. It's not to keep himself in charge. It's not to be, a renowned, prominent figure or amass political power. So he outsources. He tells them in verse 3 to keep the gates shut until the heat of the day, which I think is just getting to the fact that they're still in a frail state. So they're going to make sure that they're only opening the gate sort of once everything is bright and well lit, and we're going to shut it pretty quick, and there's still not that much going on in the city, just showing we're kind of on a continuum of building back. It's not that we get the walls and now we're 100% back, but we're better than we were. And it's setting up the rest of the book where the people now have the opportunity to return and focus more on God, just with their physical safety and well-being taken care of, and their marker that says we're the people of God established in the walls. I think all that's left to say about the list of names, and this is actually going back in time a little bit if you notice. These are people who returned dating back to the first wave of exiles 100 plus years earlier, but it's just to see that this was a team effort. This was communal, and I'm glad that we've brought that out a couple of times because Nehemiah is writing in the first person, and there's a close look at what he's doing, but it takes a lot of people in order to bring about the kind of change that we're looking for. I was reminded of Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 16, where it talks about people who through the eyes of faith are seeking a better land, even though they don't get to fully see it. And that's what these kind of people were. They headed back to Jerusalem and to Judah, even though it was burned down and rubble, in order to start getting back to God. and to start that journey homeward, even through opposition. And so I think there's a lot that we can relate to there. For next time, let's read chapter 8, and we're going to talk about the people starting to get to know the Word of God again and return to Him in worship. So be ready to discuss chapter 8 for next class, please. Thank you.